Order, and welcome back to what feels like the fourth or fifth round of today's hearings in the Standards Committee on the Code of Conduct. And it's great to have Kate Green, the former chair of the committee, here with us. And do you have some kind of preliminary comments that you'd like to make? You'll have read our reports. Are there things that you think where we're going completely off track? Or think?
No, I think it's a good report. I think there are places where it's clear it's still proving difficult to reach consensus, both perhaps within the committee and certainly in the wider parliamentary community, and you can see where some of those areas are reading through the report. But I particularly like the clarity about the distinction between rules and principles. I think the work that has been done, and I suppose I should declare a bit of an interest in it, around amplifying the principles with explanations, which was begun when I was chair of the committee, which is why I declare a certain amount of support for it, is good and helpful. And I think the report has made me more starkly aware of how vulnerable our system of self-regulation may be becoming in the eyes of the public.
So that sort of leads me on to another question, which is, do you think MPs should, the present composition, will doubtless come on to the question of appeal, but leaving that to one side just for the minute, do you think MPs should play any role, or should we be cauterised out of the system or not?
I was a fairly strong advocate of self-regulation when I was a member of the committee, and I believe that parliamentarians should be as capable of it as any other profession. But I think that a number of things will have caused that to be called into question in the eyes of the public. I think the recent Owen Paterson case, despite what I heard you say in the last session about the way in which Parliament and the committee recovered from that and came out of it in what's probably a good place. Nonetheless, I think from the public's point of view, it opened up a whole debate about these people are not fit to run their own system. I also think that reading the report, it's very clear that we now have a very distinct, different set of routes for ICGS and non-ICGS cases. And I think the public may ask why. And we, as a committee, had often noted when I was a member, and I expect you still do, that often Parliament has a tendency to be dealing with the last scandal, not the next one. And so I do wonder if we need to think about whether our system of self-regulation is fit for the next scandal that's coming along. Play
devil's advocate, you could argue that we've only had this system really for a year now. And this committee with 7 and 7, I think, for 3 years, with voting rights for lay members.
3 years.
Yeah, so if we keep on changing the system endlessly, there's a danger that maybe nobody really understands the system, is there?
I'm sure that's true, but I'm not sure how well the system is understood anyway. I'm not proactively advocating getting rid of self-regulation. I'm saying, though, I think there may be quite a lot of work to do to shore it up in the eyes of the public.
Go on, Jane.
Sorry, I was just thinking about this earlier, Kate, and I'd just be really interested in your thoughts in the sense of where the public perception comes from. So, because what the public see is the end result generally in Parliament. So it sees when things get to Parliament and how Parliament and the Commons behave more than perhaps the public perception of how this committee actually works and operates. So potentially this committee is tarred by what happens in the chamber. And I just wonder whether you think that the point of self-regulation, the self-regulation that the public see is what happens generally in the House of Commons, less about what happens here and the outcome of the cases that happen a lot of the time that don't get to that public perception.
I'm sure that's correct. I don't think the public are aware of the detail and the care that's put into looking at cases both by the Commissioner and her team and by the committee. I don't think the public, or indeed probably all of our colleagues, really understand the role of the lay members on the committee and the fact that now you have this inbuilt, although so far as I'm aware not yet utilised majority should it come to a vote and should you choose to vote as a block. And I think you're right to say that the bit that the public see is the drama mostly taking place in the chamber. And so I repeat my point, it's not that I think that our system necessarily needs to change again, but I think the bit that is most visible to the public is probably undermining at times the good work of the committee and of the Commissioner.
Bertie, do you want to ask about appeals?
Yeah, if I can. Thanks, Kate, for coming before us. You and I have worked in the past on EU national rights and others, and you in fact invited me to consider coming on this committee. So if there's any gripes,
it's your fault.
I'd like to put on record that it was you that suggested it first. Kate, you and I spoke a couple of years ago about what you've just alluded to, which is, given the Owen Paterson debacle, you're now more of the mind that actually perhaps the adjudicating functions of this committee, the disciplinary functions, not the functions of oversight or drafting the code, but the adjudicating functions perhaps might be better served with a different structure. And I've long argued that. I've long argued that a panel of 14 people, whether it's MPs, lay people, mixture, is not the appropriate panel to adjudicate in these matters, whether it's stationary claims or otherwise. Would you say, from your revision of your own thoughts on this, that the existing, albeit new, IEP might be an appropriate port of call should this committee recommend that we hive off our disciplinary function following the judge-led review that we've got? Or would you suggest a completely new creature?
Well, I think you're preempting whether or not you need to make a change at all. And as I say, I'm open-minded on that. Yes. I'm not firmly saying I think that we should. I'm saying I think if we don't, we will need to do other work to reassure public opinion that the structures we have at the moment are fit for purpose and working well. If we were, however, to be making a change away from self-regulation, I think one of the things your report exposes very clearly is the different steps in the process and at what point might you want to either have or not have MPs as part of the process. And the report seems to be pretty certain that you do need that expert understanding that comes from being a parliamentarian, at least as an element of the process, albeit not necessarily with the decision-making roles that MPs in the process have at the moment. I also think that the Paterson case and the way that it was debated in the chamber really exposed the lack of understanding among fellow parliamentarians about the inquisitorial nature of the Commissioner's inquiries and about the role of the committee in acting, as it were, as the court of appeal in terms of whether or not a breach had occurred, guilt or innocence, if you like, which I think has become clearer as a result of the way in which you as a committee have tried to explain that in the light of the Paterson case. So I think there may be quite a lot to be gained simply by clarifying the existing processes and MPs' role at each point in the existing process. However, if you were thinking about the only way in which you could preserve confidence in the system was to move to something in which MPs had no role other than, and I think there is absolute consensus, a role at the very end of the process in that nobody else should be able to suspend or expel a member from Parliament. I'm again open-minded. I think the IEP model would need to be extended quite a lot to accommodate all the other kinds of cases that come before this committee, and extended not just in scale but in terms of knowledge, expertise, skill sets. We haven't recruited, as far as I know, to the IEP to understand the financial or
Yeah.
Other breaches that are considered routinely by the committee. Alternatively, if you were to set up two separate independent processes, one for the behaviour code cases and one for the rest, that's a lot of bureaucracy. It's a lot of house bureaucracy. And I think the transition to doing either of those things would be quite tortuous, which is why the Chair's point that we've got a system that's relatively newly working as it currently is, perhaps we should just let it settle down and build up confidence in that, might be at least the best approach for now. Certainly, I think the judge-led review that you're initiating would actually put us all in a better position to answer the question you've just asked. But I think it is a question that we should be asking.
Thank you, Kate.
Thanks. Bernard?
Who done grounds for appeal?
That was us doing grounds
Right,
for appeal. No, we've not asked the specific about grounds for appeal.
Right,
no.
okay, I'll come to that in a second. And forgive me for arriving a little late.
I think we started a little early, Bernard.
I actually came onto the committee very committed to the idea of an IEP type system. And I've listened very carefully to everything, and I'm modifying my views. But in fact, the Committee on Standards and Public Life Chair, who was with us this morning, is now promoting the IEP model. And I said, but what about the lack of MP expertise? And he said, well, that might have to be involved in some way. So if we had the existing IEP, but with one or two specially appointed members, senior members of Parliament, who are appointed for the purpose, not of voting, but of participating in the proceedings, so that they can raise the flag and say, no, you don't understand, Parliament doesn't work like that, this is how it works. And obviously, the Commissioner would also advise the IEP on those matters. Do you think that's a sufficiently a compromise? And maybe even if it was just for the appeals over the top of this committee, but the main objection that I think the Chair raised was that it is invidious for members of Parliament to be marking their own homework. The public have no confidence in it, however unfair that may be. That we mustn't be seen to be marking our own homework, and that lacks public confidence. So what do you think about all those issues?
So I guess if you're asking me if there were, as it were, a pure IEP model, would I agree that there should be at least a couple of MPs, senior parliamentarians, on that committee in some sort of perhaps quasi-advisory role as an absolute minimum? I think, having talked a great deal over the last few minutes about public confidence in the system, I think that would be a minimum to command parliamentarians' confidence in the system.
Yes.
Because we hear again and again from our colleagues, don't we, that lay members can't understand our jobs. Now, I happen to know, having worked closely with lay members since I first came on the committee in 2017, and some of you were lay members then and are still, that's a rather lazy characterisation of your understanding of an MP's job, and none of us can understand a job we've not done in the way that somebody who has done it can. But I think it's not fair to say that lay members haven't put a great deal of time and effort into understanding a great deal about parliamentarians' jobs. But I think there is a real issue of, are parliamentarians going to be confident in a system where parliamentarians are not involved at any point in the decision-making process to say, but hang on, you don't understand how that bit works for us, albeit that it might be only in a sort of advisory way. But do I think we should go all the way to an IEP model with that advisory function built in or not? As I say, I'm really not sure, Bernard. I think the pressure to do so from outside Parliament is probably as great or greater than it's been at any time that I've been on the committee, since I've been on the committee. But I think there are other ways we could and should attempt to see if we can shore up a sufficiently a system that inspires sufficient public confidence and that we ourselves are confident in and proud of.
The supplementary then is, were we to maintain the existing system but overlay an IEP type model as just an appeal body, it would satisfy those who are not quite convinced that we are the appeal body. But then the grounds for appeal, to give confidence, the lack of confidence of most colleagues in the Patterson case was about the interpretation of the rules. And it would have to be, you could appeal on, you could appeal against a sanction, or you could appeal on a point of interpretation.
A misapplication of the law, of the rules.
Yeah, you'd have to have that as a grounds for appeal, because that's where a body of lay members and MPs does not command confidence. That we are sufficiently au fait with evidence, interpretation of evidence, and interpretation of rules and precedents, and it might also create a more solid collection of precious precedents for us to lean against. When we're always finding, we actually always find we're reinventing the wheel. I mean, this committee, it's quite hard work. What do you think about that?
Yes, I guess I'm quite in favour of quite wide grounds for appeal. And you point to some of the reasons for that in the report, in the interests of the parliamentarian who is the subject of the complaint. But I actually also think that we saw, certainly in relation to one appeal I was involved in while we still handled ICGS cases entirely on this committee, that narrow grounds for appeal didn't always serve the complainant very well either. So I'm quite in favour of wide grounds for appeal. Do I think involving MPs in making those appeal decisions undermines public confidence, or the public lack confidence in MPs' ability and capacity to do that? Yes, I think that's the case at the moment, but I do think that work has been done in the light of the Patterson case, at least to explain that there is an appeal function de facto in the way that this committee takes the Commissioner's findings, offers an opportunity to the MP to make their response to the committee in writing and in person, and then reaches a conclusion. So I think you've demonstrated more clearly how that part of the appeal process works, and that may serve to boost public opinion. People may feel a little bit more confident. And in relation to sanctions, I can't think of an instance where the public have been hostile to the sanction imposed when one has been. It has tended more to be a sense that, oh, they just let them off.
No.
Yes, I've not noticed anybody saying, gosh, that's a terribly high sanction. I've had quite a lot of, I mean, it's only Twitter, isn't it? But, you know, people saying it's disgraceful, you've let them off with X.
Just a very wee supplementary, Chair, if I may, because we're getting rid of the provision for serious and contested cases to go to a special panel. Yes. I mean, that's what we're recommending. Yeah. Surely we have to replace that with something, because that was intended to be there for a reason. Okay, it's never been used, and I would argue it's never been used because actually, if the Commissioner is chairing the panel and casting no aspersions on the Commissioner, it would be unlikely to reach a different conclusion from the conclusion the Commissioner has already reached.
But I think those panels were about the facts, weren't they? They were to establish the facts, not
yes.
about the interpretation of the rules.
Well, I mean, it's a very odd beast. But
yes.
But
do you think we should bring? Do you agree with our recommendation to get rid of them?
Yes, I do, especially as it's never been used, and I must admit I hadn't even realised it existed.
But if we're getting rid of that, it strengthens the case for putting something else in that would be a proper appeal process.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I understand that.
Thank you very much.
We've got a couple of other things which we've been asking others about. Just wonder what your take is on second jobs generally, and you know, the Committee on Standards in Public Life has suggested that there should be a reasonableness test, so a reasonable number of hours or a reasonable amount of pay. Do you buy that one, or?
I'd rather go along with what was being said in the previous session. I have more interest in the issue of conflict of interest than I have in how much time are they spending on activities that are not per se fulfilling your parliamentary functions, because I think there's often, for people who have external roles, a good read across between the two. And I think what you want to know about is the conflict where their external interests actually lead them to not honour their obligations as a parliamentarian and to put their other interests first. And I think if you are worried that somebody is spending too much time on their external interests, the right place to resolve that is the ballot box. You're not representing me properly because you're too busy doing your second job. But I actually think, and your report doesn't say very much about this, that I'm as concerned about unremunerated conflicts of interest as remunerated conflicts of interest. If I'm a trustee of a charity, an environmental charity or an animal rights charity or a charity that campaigns for people with a particular health condition, wouldn't you like to know that when I'm participating in parliamentary proceedings on subjects of interest to that charity? If I would argue that as a parliamentarian that might enhance my knowledge and my expertise and my ability to input into that debate or those proceedings, but you might want to know that I've got at least some kind of emotional interest above and beyond the purely personal that might be something that the public should know about when I come to participate in proceedings and exercise my vote.
Yes, though you wouldn't want to, and we've said that we think people should just register everything now and not faff around with it, but I wouldn't want us to end up in a situation where, you've had, a brain tumour and you're asked to be a trustee of the brain tumour cancer, if there is one, and you decide not to because you're frightened that then that would look as if you were pursuing, the commercial interests of the brain cancer charity, because you wouldn't want to disincentivise somebody from, assisting a charity, would you?
I don't think you would do that, and I think that's about the culture and the expectations of an MP and the understanding of a registration system that isn't meant to be punitive or threatening. It's meant to be transparent and open, and that's a good thing, and we all want to be transparent and open. That's something that we regard as a good value in this Parliament, and we're quite proud to say I'm doing this and I'm open about it. So I do slightly tend to the register everything. I think one of your witnesses in the that you heard from before you produced the report was very much in that space, declare everything. And I increasingly think, actually, if you've got external interests, whether they're remunerated or not, declare them is a good mantra. I suppose the other thing I'd say is I feel increasingly, and particularly if you made the register very, very easily searchable, which I know is a long-held ambition of this committee,
yes,
that having them on the register might be sufficient, and the need to mention it every time you stand up in Parliament might not be necessary.
For an unremunerated one.
Possibly even for a remunerated one.
We were pulled in the other direction earlier, but Paul.
Okay. One of the major arguments around second jobs is that an MP can bring experience and knowledge into their role. Mr. Patterson would say, and actually did say, that that's what he was doing, although he's getting a six-figure sum and all the rest of it. But he would say that his background and experience and knowledge that he had was in enabling him to, warn of certain things. What do you have to say about that in terms of individuals who would use that kind of... for me, it was clear that that wasn't the reason why he was doing it, but that's what he would say, that he was actually bringing that experience and knowledge into his role as an MP, and he wasn't lobbying, he was warning Parliament.
He was lobbying. It was paid lobbying. And your report is really good, I think, in tightening up the provisions that we should have in relation to paid lobbying, how we could make it clearer what we mean by paid lobbying. I think the safe harbour proposal is a very good one and goes again to my point about the more we can create a positive attitude to openness, and the safe harbour provision is one of the ways you can do that, the better. So I think that we could make it harder for that kind of argument to be made by casting more sunlight on people registering what they are doing and what we define as paid lobbying that is not allowed. And I think your work in the report is very good on that.
Just a couple of other things. The ministerial capacity exemption for registering things, we've made some recommendations. We might have to finesse them a bit, but what's your broad feeling about that?
Yes, I think it's right that people who receive benefits in their capacity as a minister, it would be valuable to put them on the parliamentary register too, because they're receiving them as parliamentarians, as members of parliament, and the public will want to know. And again, if you have a very searchable register, it would be handy to have everything in one place. And I think the sort of mismatch between things like how quickly you have to register, how proactive you have to be, we should err on the side of the more demanding requirements. So I think your recommendations are sensible and I support them.
I'll come to you in a second, Rita. Just, I can't tell whether I've got this wrong, but I might have done. But it feels as if the government whips, and when the government whips, the opposition whips as well, House business more often. You can't leave, Bernard, because then we're all right in court. Is that your feeling, and in particular in relation to these issues, which are quasi-judicial? Do you think it's appropriate for government and, for that matter, opposition to whip?
Whip on standard.
Well, for instance, on a standards report.
No, I don't think it's appropriate at all.
And did it happen when you were chair?
I can't think of a single instance when it did, but I might not be remembering. Right. However, insofar as we might have encouraged colleagues to respond to a report from the committee, it would have been, don't question it, don't undermine it, would have been the message that we would have been sharing with colleagues. And particularly, I think, because I was the chair when we had the case in the House of Lords that led to the Lords really moving to a much more independent system. And right. I think there was real concern then that seeking to influence colleagues to question the work of the Standards Committee was a very dangerous space to go to.
Right. Excuse me, sorry, Bernard, you can go because we will still be quorate. Sorry, I couldn't count. Never put me in the Treasury Committee. Rita.
Thank you so much.
I wanted to go back a tiny bit on outside employment. So the Committee on Standards in Public Life, who came this morning, have said in their submission, we believe that the Standards Committee should set an indicative limit of hours and remuneration with a rebuttable presumption that paid outside employment exceeding those limits would be considered unreasonable. I can't quite imagine how we'd explain the idea of a rebuttable assumption to members of the public, but leaving that to one side, you've expressed a view, I think, about hours, that you don't think a limit on hours is the right thing. I think you said that a few minutes ago.
Right, yes.
And so all day I've been wondering about money, but I haven't had the courage to ask anybody, but I'm going to do that now towards the end of the day. How much is too much? So if you're really good at something which isn't a conflict of interest, so maybe you're a really good lawyer, for example, and you can earn a lot of money doing actually not that many hours. Imagine you can earn 50,000 a year. Is that too much? How much is too much? Is 100,000 too much, or is 20,000 too much? Or given that, you know, a respectable body like CSPL have said a limit on remuneration, it kind of then you get into, well, how much is reasonable and how much is too much?
Indeed.
I think it's really difficult for the committee to lay that down. Because I think what my constituents probably think of as a very large sum of money might be very different from what people who earn those sums of money think is a very large sum of money.
Yeah.
And I think it would be extremely unwise for this committee to go out and say that we think a certain figure is reasonable. I think many of our constituents would look at any figure and think these people don't live in my world. and we shouldn't therefore put ourselves in the position of saying that. It's been a long-standing enthusiasm, I think, of the Committee on Standards in Public Life that there should be a limit on time and earnings, but I repeat what I was saying a few moments ago. I think that's a matter for the ballot box, not for the committee. And I think that the issue is conflict of interest and your inability to serve the interests of your constituents first and foremost that the committee should be putting its mind to.
I agree with you about that. I mean, £3,000 is life-changing for anybody in my constituency, but £3,000 in some other constituencies is not what you get out of bed for a week. So, yeah, it is difficult, I think.
May I ask Aaron's question, as he's not here?
Yeah,
please.
Of course. And then I've got Jane, but I did promise that we'd finish at 5, and I tried to keep by my promises.
The last chair never kept us here all day long.
Yeah, the last chair would have dreamed of doing that.
Way more efficient.
So one of our proposals in relation to the Nolan principles, the 7 principles, is to add an additional principle of respect. And you were here, I think, for the last discussion we had with a member about that. It wouldn't be investigable, as has been clarified in the last session. But the idea of adding, as it were, an 8th principle and calling it respect, or it might be respectfulness, I think people heard a contribution on that this morning that they were quite attracted to. Do you support that? So the CSPL have said, well, we've talked about respect and we've decided to add it to the leadership principle. But they didn't explain it as being more than a matter of taste, really. And a number of members of this committee, but certainly not all, in terms of taste, favour an 8th principle rather than the incorporation of respect into one of the 7 principles. Do you have a view about that?
So I listened to Sir Desmond Swing giving his evidence to you, and while he was speaking, I had another look at your report to see exactly what you had said the respect principle should say, and I think Desmond was perhaps assuming it said rather more than it actually did in terms of the behaviour it would have expected of him. And I think it wasn't asking him to pretend that he had views he didn't subscribe to, or to accept or find tolerable views that he didn't find tolerable. So I think it's well written, and I think it is actually really important, particularly what we've been through in the creation of the ICGS and the events that led us to take those steps. I think it's really important to the wider parliamentary community that you have this explicit principle of respect and the way that you've articulated it in your recommendation in the report.
Thank you.
Jane.
I just wanted to go back to the point of conflict of interest. And Kate, thank you very much for saying that we work hard to for our understanding of MPs' lives. So I might show my ignorance here, but just really interesting that you said that it's important. The ballot box is where you make the decision, and it's important for you to do your work from a constituency perspective. And so there might be some things that your constituents would not see as a conflict of interest or not as lobbying, that constituents in somebody else's constituency might see as a conflict of interest or lobbying. So I don't know, if you had a big organisation in your constituency that was going to close its factory and those sorts of things, and so you're going to want to see what you can do to potentially stop that from happening. So you'll be, but that might have a conflict of interest for somewhere else where they want to open up a factory.
But surely the conflict of interest in that case is if you are employed by that or you've received donations from that, right. and that was one of the cases that we had last year, wasn't it? Because he thought the constituency exemption completely exempted him, and it didn't, because he'd still had a financial interest and wasn't therefore after.
But it's the point about unremunerated as well, isn't it?
I think in this instance, you are defending your constituents' interests.
Yeah.
You would rely on the constituency exemption. I'm very sorry if it's not in the interest of Chris's constituents, but they have Chris to defend them. And when I'm saying, well, I want to keep this factory open in my constituency because it's 400 jobs and it's really
They have the
important,
defence
and
to
Chris
do
is
that.
saying we would love it to relocate to my constituency, then we both have the opportunity to speak out for our constituents, and there's no conflict of interest there.
No, I remember being very cross when Burberry were closing in my constituency and they were going to evict Coopers.
They weren't coming to Stretford and Urmston, though, Chris.
No.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Apparently you were a wonderful chair of the committee and we've fallen on hard times of late. So
You've had a very demanding time of late, I'd certainly say that.
we've been quite busy, that is true. We may be... am I right to say that it is possible that we may have another case coming? Oh, sorry, I should move to private. Switch to private.